Okay, so we are just to place us where we need to be. We're in the middle of the third book of the Torah, the book of Leviticus, Vayikra, which up until this point spent a lot of time on the laws that are related to the temple. You have offerings in the temple. That was two portions. And then we had the inauguration of the temple when it occurred on the eighth day in the desert, in the desert. Then you had two parshas of laws of purity and impurity, also somewhat related to the temple, because one of the ramifications of impurity is that a person cannot go to the temple when they're ritually impure. And then last week we talked about the service of the high priest on Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the year, in the holiest place in the world, which is the Holy of Holies. And in a way, the holiest soul, if you can say that, which is the high priest. So a lot of it is dedicated to holy and unique circumstances. In a way, I mentioned this last week, in a way, that's the book, the name of the book in English is Leviticus, which is the book related to the Levites, related to the priestly tribe, which is the Levites. The priests, the Kohanim, are a branch within the Levites. And even though today we refer to the book as the book of Vayikra, which is one of the first word of the book, which is "and God called," but in the past, the sages refer to this book as Torah Kohanim, the laws of the priests, and that seems appropriate because a lot of this book is about, up to this point, like I said, it's about the temple and it's about the service in the temple. And last week, not only the priest but the high priest, and that was sort of a chunk of the book. The transition started last week, but in this week is even more powerful. In this week's Parsha, which is actually called Kedoshim, to be holy, which we would think is difficult to attain, and maybe a certain population within the Jewish people could be holy, maybe the priest, maybe the high priest. No. In this week's Parsha, we have something like over 50 commandments, and most of these commandments are applicable to every person, to every Jew, outside of the temple. Has nothing to do with the priests. It has to do with living daily life in a moral way. And so many commandments, nothing earth-shattering, nothing too spiritual, mostly in the day-to-day life. And interestingly, that's the portion that we name Kedoshim, holy, not the portion of Yom Kippur, which was last week. So this is a shift of what the definition of holiness is. The definition of holy could be thought about as the times that a person is separate and apart from the mundane activities. But Judaism's idea of holiness is the contrary, is bringing sanctity to the daily trivial matters of life. So that's an introduction to the introduction. And now we're going to read the Parsha in a nutshell. It's very interesting. It's a very short Parsha, relatively short. It's 64 verses. And in these 64 verses, there's something like 51, depending on your count, but more than 50 commandments. So almost every verse is a commandment. So if the entire Torah has 613 commandments, 50 of them are in this one short Parsha. Okay, so that's introduction to the introduction. Now we'll do the Parsha in a nutshell, and then we could start thinking about reading some of the stories, the laws more carefully. So I think we'll keep busy today. Is it sharing? I think it's sharing. Not 100% sure it's sharing yet. You are screen sharing. Do you see the text on the screen, or is it just me?
Yes, we do see.
You see the Parsha in a nutshell, right?
Yes, we do see.
Good. Okay. Kedoshim in a nutshell. Again, Kedoshim means to be holy. The name of the Parsha, Kedoshim, means holy ones, and is found in Leviticus chapter 19, verse 2. The Parsha of Kedoshim begins with the statement, "You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy." This is, again, who are we talking to? We're talking to the Jewish people, all the Jewish people. This is followed by dozens of mitzvot, divine commandments, through which the Jew sanctifies him or herself and relates to the holiness of God. So they're not going to do justice to the whole list of commandments, but we'll just do it's a very short nutshell, but we'll have to read it more in depth. These include the prohibition against idolatry, the mitzvah of charity, the principle of equality before the law, Shabbat, sexual morality, honesty in business, honor and awe of one's parents, and the sacredness of life. Also in Kedoshim is the dictum which the great sage Rabbi Akiva called the cardinal principle of the Torah, and of which Hillel said, this is the entire Torah. The rest is commentary. Love your fellow as yourself. So that all-important verse, love your fellow as yourself, it appears in the heart of this week's parsha. So this is a nutshell, even more than usual, even more than always. The nutshell does not do justice to all the commandments, but a little bit of taste just to get our feet wet. That is the function of the nutshell. Now we can open up the actual parsha. Maybe we'll read a little bit, and we'll try to get a little bit of a feel here. Kedoshim Torah reading. Okay, before we even start, I just want to read one or two verses, continuing the theme that I mentioned before, that holiness is for everybody. So let's read so this is the beginning of the parasha, Leviticus chapter 19, verse 1 and 2. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the entire congregation of the children of Israel, and say to them, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. Okay, very simple verse, introductory verse, introducing the theme of holiness. What is interesting is in verse 2, the first half of the verse, the first clause, speak to the entire congregation of the children of Israel. So this is very interesting because most parshas or most commandments do not have an introduction that includes all the children of Israel. Usually the most famous introduction to the commandment is Hashem spoke to Moses saying, either by Yomer Hashem al Moshe or Vayedaber Hashem al Moshe. God spoke to Moses. There's two ways of saying spoke in Hebrew, Vayomer, Vayedaber. God spoke to Moses, then Moses' job is to convey it to everybody. There are very few places, maybe maybe two places that I can think of right now, that God, as an introduction, God tells Moshe, gather the entire congregation of the children of Israel, which is an additional emphasis because presumably Moshe is not keeping the wisdom for himself. He's going to tell it to everybody. So why over here does the Torah have to emphasize speak to the entire congregation? And there are there's many different interpretations, but if you want to sort of digest, there's two general interpretations. One interpretation is that because we're talking about holiness, people may think that holiness is not applicable to everybody. Holiness is like we learned last week, the high priest on Yom Kippur. If you go into the Holy of Holies, that's when you're holy. But here the Torah is saying, no, speak to the entire congregation of the children of Israel. Understand that everybody is able to achieve holiness. Every individual is able to achieve holiness, not just the priest, not just on a special time of Yom Kippur, but anybody all the time. And that's why the introduction is so important. Speak to the entire community of the Jewish people. That's sort of one interpretation. Another Hasidic interpretation, which is very, very beautiful, is, in the Hasidic movement, a lot of it was about the community, getting together with the tzaddik, with the righteous person, and singing in prayer together, and creating a brotherhood, a sisterhood, of community of fellow Hasidim who serve God together. That was a lot part of the Hasidic lifestyle. So one of the early Hasidic commentators wrote something very beautiful on this parsha. He begins to quote Maimonides. And Maimonides says a very interesting concept that today is obviously true. We recognize it as true, that a person is very much influenced by their surroundings. You have all these social science studies where if everybody in the room says something, even if it's absolutely ridiculous, they set up studies where everybody in the room says something outrageous, and then the person who's not part of the study doesn't realize that everybody else is in on it, and very often the person is going to follow what everybody else says, because that's where we are. We're social animals. We're affected by our surroundings. So Maimonides says if a person is living in a place that is immoral, he doesn't have any good friends, in other words, friends that are moral, you have to separate yourself. Maimonides says run to the hills, go outside of civilization, because you're going to be influenced by your surroundings. So that's what Maimonides says. So this Hasidic commentator says, yes, of course Maimonides is right. If you don't want to sin, you should leave a negative society and live on by yourself. But then he says, but to be holy, you can't be holy alone. That's what the verse says, speak to the entire congregation of the children of Israel. You want to be holy, you have to be with other people, because together with the other people, that's when you can achieve holiness because everybody contributes to the experience. And when you speak to the entire congregation of the children of Israel, that's when you achieve holiness. So I thought that was beautiful as an introduction. One more commentary that I heard this year I heard a recording from the Rebbe the first time that I heard. Okay, go ahead, Vicky. Vicky, go ahead, please.
Well, I just had a follow-up question about what you just said. When you're you're surrounded by immoral people, but there is a reason you're placed in there, right? So
Yeah.
how do you reconcile? I mean, you can run, but at the same time, you have to understand maybe that's your role.
Right. So that's a good question, and certainly the Hasidic perspective is that you should try to influence the situation. But I think Maimonides is recognizing that it's very difficult, and sometimes a person feels that he needs to fortify himself first before he can expose himself to the influences, and therefore perhaps that's what Maimonides is saying. You have to guard yourself against negative influences. I would just say that there was something that the Rebbe spoke about a lot, and because obviously the Rebbe sent his followers to places that were communities that were not necessarily seen as a conducive to the Hasidic or to Orthodox lifestyle. And something that the Rebbe pointed out is a very interesting halachic concept when it comes to koshering of vessels. So let's say I have a vessel that's not kosher. The theory is that the taste, if I cook a non-kosher dish in a pot, so the taste of the dish would go into the walls of the pots. So then you have to clean it, and you have to put it in boiling water, whatever the process is, and then it will give out the taste. So then the halacha says, 1 second, if it's giving out the taste, maybe it's going to swallow it back in again. That's what the code of that's the question. And the Talmud says like this. I don't know if it's scientific, but it's theoretical. The Talmud says, because the dish is busy giving out, because it's spitting out, doesn't have time to swallow. And Rebbe talked about this, and he said, if you're spitting out, you're not able to take in. So if you're influencing, you won't be influenced. So that's supporting what you say. But in general, again, this is what Maimonides says, and sometimes you can influence, sometimes you have to try, but sometimes you can't. If they're wicked, you can't always influence, and sometimes you have to protect yourself. That's what Maimonides says. And like I said, the point is here that according to the Hasidic interpretation, yes, to protect yourself, you be alone. But to be holy, you can never be alone. To be holy is being in society. To be holy is being with other people. And that's where holiness is achieved. So I thought that's beautiful. Another interesting.
Rabbi, may I ask you a question?
Go ahead, please.
Has there ever been a time in Jewish history where going off into the wilderness to get away from a bad influence was acceptable? Or is the issue always to go into a place of other people who are more, shall we say, holy?
So pre-Hasidic movement, it was very common for the scholars to try to be separate. So it wasn't, they weren't necessarily running to the hills, but they were separating themselves from the masses. And that was a way of maintaining their own piety. So they're not going to be distracted in their studies. And it developed over time, but there was a certain division between the people who were very scholarly or very spiritual and the masses, and they tried to separate themselves from the masses. I mentioned this last week or was it a few weeks ago, when we talked about the laws of purity and impurity. So part of the laws of purity and impurity in the times of the temple, it forced a certain division between the people who were trying to maintain spiritual purity, let's say the priests who have to go to the temple, and the masses, because the people are not protected against spiritual impurity. They could touch things that are spiritually impure, that are ritually impure. And then they would, so there was a certain separation that was built in. In fact, the traditional, what we would call today traditional Judaism, or the rabbis or the sages, in real time when they operated, they were actually called Perushim, or in English, Pharisees. And Pharisees literally means the people who are separate and apart, because there was something to the idea that, yes, if you have to maintain a certain standard of ritual purity or spirituality, so there is a notion that you have to be separate and apart. And that is a common notion, not just within Judaism, I think in all faiths. But the Hasidic movement looks at this verse and says, no. It says that is, it's a defensive mechanism, but it's not going to get you to holiness. And holiness is, could you connect to other people? And we'll try to elaborate about that a little bit later when we talk about love your fellow as yourself. And that's its own discussion. But the answer is, yeah, there is anyone who's trying to be spiritual and trying to be holy. Usually, there's a temptation and a pull, and a logical one to separate from everybody else. I just want to say one word about the word holy. What does holy mean? And it's a word that people hear and talk about and think about. But the question is, could we put a definition on the term holiness? And I'm sure there are multiple definitions, but for the purpose of today's discussion, especially in the context of this parsha, you would say that I would say two things. First of all, the etymology of the term holy is also designated and separate. In a way, it is the idea of separation. So separating from the temptation or the distraction is one way of thinking about holiness. That's the definition of the word holiness in some way. But there's another definition of holiness, and in this case, holiness would be, because again, holiness doesn't mean necessarily doing something that is transcendent, because this whole idea of this parsha is the way you live your daily life, you can be holy. So what is holiness? So you have to find a new definition. So one definition is, if you use something for its true intended purpose, in other words, consistent with its inner purpose, that is the definition of holiness. So everything could be holy. So if you're doing something and that thing is actually, you're using something in a destructive way, that's unholy. Why is that unholy? Because you're separating the object from its intended purpose. But if you're doing that same thing in a constructive way, then that's a holy experience because you are using it consistent with its intended goal. And that's why you also have the idea of separation. Separation is separate from this thing, from the negative aspect of this thing, and use it in a way that's conducive to its intended purpose. So that's just talking a little bit about the definition of the word holiness. Okay, now there are many commandments in the Torah. We could sort of get stuck on some of them, but I want to at least give a few details and almost show in some ways how continuing on this theme of everything to be holy. So some of the commandments that seem just ritual doesn't necessarily seem that there's a very deep spiritual message for us, but hopefully we can show how they also all capture this same truth. One thing I want to say is that I'm jumping a little around a little bit. One of the things we said earlier is that God spoke to the entire God tells Moshe, gather the entire congregation. And the more spiritual interpretation is because everyone could be holy. But there are also practical interpretations of why that is. This parsha is very important. And so why is it so important? So some of the rabbis say, the Medrash actually says this, because this parsha, in a way, is an elaboration of the 10 Commandments. So you have 10 Commandments, which are general, but then what are the details of those 10 Commandments? So in some ways, if you read it, you could read this parsha as an elaboration of the 10 Commandments. So many of the mitzvot of this parsha are going to mention those commandments, but it's also an elaboration. So right away in the beginning of the parsha, you're going to see commandments such as that appear in the parsha, in the 10 Commandments, such as idol worship, not to serve idols, and such as Shabbat, keeping the Shabbat, and honoring parents, if I didn't say that one yet, right? So we read verse 1 and 2. Let's read verse 3 and 3. Let's read verse 3. Where every man shall fear his mother and his father, or be in awe of his mother and his father, and you shall observe my Shabbat. I am the Lord your God. So again, we know this already. Okay, it's an elaboration of the Ten Commandments, and that's why next verse 4, you shall not turn to the worthless idols, nor shall you make molten deities for yourselves. I am the Lord your God. So again, this is an elaboration and it's a repetition and elaboration of the most important principles in Judaism as they appear in the Ten Commandments.
Rabbi,
Okay. Yeah.
what a very, not simple, but complex example of holiness in daily life, which is somewhat outside of the Ten Commandments, but something which we all encounter is this. If you don't get what you want, or someone isn't doing exactly what you want, exactly the way you want it, would holiness be, which is being like God, being patient and not becoming irritated and angry because your particular needs aren't being frustrated, are not being met at that moment? Would that be an example of holiness, which is restraint, patience, and not becoming irritated or angry?
I would say yes. I would say yes. And I would just add that although most of the ideas in this parsha, most of the commandments are more behavioral, behave in a certain way. But this is a parsha where you have certain mitzvot that are not behavioral, that are supposed to educate a person how to feel. And the best example is love your fellow as yourself. So mandating love. Talk about how is that possible, but that's later on in the class, hopefully. And also toward the end of the parsha, there's the idea that person should not hold a grudge, and a person should not take revenge, right? So that's much more than behavioral, because the way the rabbis define taking a grudge is, let's say somebody holding a grudge. So let's say I ask my friend to lend me his axe, and he says no. And the next day, he asks me. So if I say I'm not giving it to you because you didn't give me yours, that's taking revenge. If I say I'm not like you, I'm going to give you the axe even though you did not give it to me, that's holding a grudge. That's what the Torah means when the Torah says do not hold a grudge. So you see here these examples. It's not really behavior; it's also how to feel about other people. So yes, I agree with you. Even though even though a lot of the mitzvot here are behavioral, because the Torah is very practical in most cases, but in this case, you see how sometimes the Torah elaborates beyond what's practical. Where do you that itself? In other words, beyond the action, but also regulates the emotion.
So,
And
Rabbi, combining what you just said in terms of the question I posed, which is an everyday question for practically every human being, the behavior would be getting irritated or angry at the other person. That's
right.
clearly not holy. But
Right.
also the feeling, which is
Yeah.
to not even feel impatient, to not
Right.
even feel angry, to not even feel rejected, to somehow find a way to maintain a position of equanimity when
Yes.
you're clearly not getting what you want from somebody in your life or someone you're dealing with. And that goes on every day for all of us.
Correct. So now the question is, how is that possible? So hopefully we'll have a few minutes to discuss that when we talk about the mitzvah of love your fellow as yourself, which seems like an impossibility to me. So we can talk about that. But yes, the answer is yes. Somehow the Torah is regulating also how we feel, or wants us to regulate how we feel. I'm just going to say, going back to the theme that everything is tied back to the Ten Commandments, if you think about the Ten Commandments, most of the Ten Commandments are behavioral. This is what you should do. This is what you shouldn't do. Right? The beginning is faith, believe in one God. But right after that, you get to the ideas of action. Don't make idols. Don't say God's name in vain, right? Keep the Shabbat day. These are all actions. There's only one of the Ten Commandments which regulates how a person feels. What is that? Maybe in some ways the hardest of the Ten Commandments. If I ask you what's the hardest of the Ten Commandments to keep, in some ways is not to covet. The last one, lo tachmo, don't be jealous, don't covet. Because if to do that right is trying to influence how I feel. And then the question is, how do I do that? But you're right, again, this is the elaboration of the Ten Commandments, and the Ten Commandments themselves, you also will find some of that feeling of regulating how I feel and bringing holiness to the way I feel. So that's important discussion. Okay, there are very important things to talk about this parsha, but I have a certain bias towards things that I have not seen in the past. So maybe it's not the most important interpretation, but I'm going to say it here because that's what I'm at, because this is the new stuff. But I do want to talk about the love your fellow as yourself, because that's so important. But give me just a little bit, you'll indulge me a little bit in verse 3. Every man shall fear or be in awe of his mother and father, and you shall observe my Shabbat, I am the Lord your God. So I saw a beautiful commentary, a city commentary, that says as follows. If we're talking about holiness, and this is the first commandment after verse 2, right? Verse 2 says, speak to the entire congregation of the children of Israel and say to them, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. So we should be holy because God is holy. Okay, what's the first thing you tell me? The first thing you tell me is verse 3, and verse 3 has two clauses: honor your mother and father, and honor and guard the Shabbat. Okay, I'm sure they're very important commandments. They appear in the Ten Commandments. But why is this the first thing we say? And why the juxtaposition of these two themes, honoring father and mother and Shabbat, in the same verse? So I'm sure there could be many interpretations, but one interpretation I thought was very creative and beautiful is, if the theme of this parsha is that holiness could be found not only in the spiritual, but in the physical and daily life, then this is the perfect verse. Why? Because honoring father and mother represents that there's holiness in the physical reality, and honoring Shabbat represents that there's holiness in the spiritual soul connecting to God. How so? Because Shabbat is the time to recognize God. God created the world in 6 days, and 7th day he rested. So on Shabbat, we want to connect to the divine, to our divine soul, but also to God. So that's holiness. That's finding holiness in the spiritual. But then think about this for a second. Why honor father and mother? Okay, they took care of you, fine. You want to be grateful, but there's something deeper than that, because they are responsible for the physical life, for your body. There's this rabbi who goes around and gives lectures about all kinds of things. But one thing he says, I don't know if this is true, I presume it's true, that at least somewhere there was a kid who sued his parents. Why? Because he said, I didn't want to be born. And you forced me to be born. So you caused me all this pain. So he's going to sue his parents because his parents caused them all this pain. Right? Wonderful. He probably was going to win the lawsuit because he probably has, it's a good claim. But if we say, no, honor your parents. Why honor my parents? Maybe I don't want to be born. Why do I have to honor my parents? Nobody asked me to be born. So the answer is, you're honoring your parents because you're honoring the idea that physical life is holy and physical life is sacred. And that's why you honor not just God on the Shabbat, who gave you your soul, but you also honor your parents, who give you your body. So that's one way of thinking about verse 3 is that verse 3 is all inclusive because it encapsulates the theme of the entire parsha, which is that the physical could be found, that the holiness could be found not only on the Shabbat, which represents the connection to God, but also in the physical world, the physical body, which interaction between physical people, which is representative of the idea, which is represented by the idea of honor your parents, because they give you physical life. And that's the holiness that you find in physical life. Okay, there's one more thing I want to say before I want to go to love your fellow as yourself. And that is, it's going to be, I'm just going to scroll a little bit. Again, we can't do everything in a few minutes, but what am I looking for? The Arla. This is a very interesting commandment. Very interesting commandment. Right here. Okay, it's called Arla. The Arla literally means covering, a blockage. And the commandment is as follows. The commandment is the first 3 years after a person plants a tree, for the first 3 years, a person is not supposed to eat of the fruit of the tree. On the 4th year, in temple times, the fruit is holy. You have to take the fruit and eat it in Jerusalem. And on the 5th year, you could go and eat the fruit wherever you want. That's the pattern. So let's read verse 23, 24, 25. When you come to the land and you plant any food tree, you shall surely block its fruit from use. That's the word arla, blockage. It shall be blocked from use for 3 years, not to be eaten. And in the 4th year, all its fruit shall be holy, a praise to the Lord. Meaning it's holy, and the commentaries explain, the rabbis explain, the rabbinic interpretation explains, the oral Torah explains that we take, because you have to praise God with these fruit. Where do you praise God? In the temple. You take the fruit, you bring it to Israel, to Jerusalem, and you have to eat it within the walls of Jerusalem. It's considered holy. On the 5th year, you may eat its fruit. In other words, there's no specific regulation. You can eat the fruit wherever you want. And it continues, do this in order to increase its produce for you. I am the Lord your God. Very interesting commandment. It's actually a little bit counterintuitive, because usually within the Torah, the first is considered holy. The firstborn is considered holy. And over here, the first fruit are considered holy, right? The first fruit that grow every year is the mitzvah of bikurim. The first fruit was supposed to take it to the temple. So, but over here, the first 3 years, don't eat it. And then the 4th year, you could eat it in Jerusalem. And then the 5th year, you can eat it wherever you want. Okay, what's really happening here? Again, there are many ways of reading this very important mitzvah. Just a quick dip into one perspective, and that is that this is a correction for the sin of the tree of knowledge in the book of Genesis, in the beginning of the history. So there, what happens was God tells Adam not to eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge, and Adam succumbs, and he eats the fruit. And according to the Medrash, the problem with Adam was not that he ate the fruit. There's nothing wrong with the fruit. Is that he ate it prematurely. And even some interpretations say the tree was the vine. It was grape. And he was created Friday afternoon. And the commandment was supposed to last till the Shabbat. Don't drink on Friday afternoon. Wait for the weekend. Wait for Shabbat. And if he waited 3 hours, he would be able to eat the fruit. So the whole big sin that caused death to the world, that caused the spiritual calamity, is only because Adam could not wait 3 hours. And the Medrash says to correct that, Adam's children, we wait 3 years. Okay, so I'm just saying this Medrash is because, yeah.
I'm hearing this, always fascinating listening to you. What I'm hearing is that sin was impatience.
Correct. And it's impatience, but that's one interpretation, but it could be deeper than that. And I'm just going to say like this: we have in this physical world, we're blessed with a lot of I don't know what the word is. We have so many possessions that we interact with. Now the question is, are any of these beneficial, or are they destructive to our spiritual side, to our spiritual life, or even our physical life? Right? The fact that we have so much access to food that is not just necessary, but is pleasurable. Is it a good thing or is it a bad thing? On one hand, it's good. Look, you can go to the store and you can buy anything you want any time of the year. It's unbelievable. The Talmud talks about the super wealthy in Talmudic times. There was the Roman Caesar, and his friend Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, the great sage, was also just as wealthy. And you know what the wealth meant? They were so wealthy that they could have any vegetable any time of the year. They could have snow. They could have what do they call it? Scallions. They can have scallions year round, because in those days you ate what was local, right? If you're so wealthy, you can have scallions year round. Now today you can be poor and you can walk into the supermarket and have scallions year round, right? Not just scallions. You can have anything you want. So on one hand, there's a tremendous amount of abundance. Now the question is this abundance good for us, physically and spiritually, or is it destructive? And the answer is very simple. And this is about food. It's about technology. It's about anything. If you're controlling it, it's good for you. If it's controlling you, it's destructive. It's going to bring death, both physical death and spiritual death. So is my cell phone good or bad? It depends. If I'm controlling it, if I'm using it for my benefit, it's good. If it's controlling me, then it's negative. Alcohol, whatever you want, everything. Now, what's the story? How do you know if you're controlling it or it's controlling you? What's the test? The test is if you could say no. You know, every addict says, if I want, I could stop. If I wanted to stop, I could stop. The definition of an addict is that he can't stop, right? So the question is not, is this vine, is this grape that Adam ate, It's not a question of is it objectively good or bad. It depends. If you could be patient, if you could say no, then even when you say yes, you're in control. If you're in control, it's constructive. It can bring you closer to God. If you can say no, God says, don't eat it, not yet. But I can't hold myself back. That's the test that it's controlling me. If it's controlling me, it's going to bring to death, not just spiritual death, physical death. So that is a little bit about this, the importance of this mitzvah. But now I want to talk generally speaking. I want to talk very generally. You can really, every object in this world could be divided into these three categories of the first 3 years, the 4th year, and the 5th year. What do I mean? Let's use that pattern as a model for everything in this world. Everything in this world is either a sin, right? In the Torah, there are certain things you're not allowed to do. Okay, so that's a prohibition. That's the first 3 years. Then you come to the 4th year. What's the 4th year? It's a mitzvah. This is praise to God. Take it to the temple. It's holy. That's the 4th year. What is the 5th year? The 5th year is the majority of experiences and objects in this world, which is they're neutral. They're not a mitzvah. They're not a sin. I think I'm freezing up here. It's not a sin, but it's also not a mitzvah. It's not a commandment. You don't have to do it. It's neutral. So what we see from this pattern, from the way the way the commentators read this, so certainly the Hasidic commentators, it's actually ascending. You start at the bottom and you work your way up. So the beginning is, of course, you have to separate from things that are negative. Above that is the mitzvah, there's the commandments. Follow God's commandments. That's the 4th year. The 5th year is even more holy. We're not talking about taking the fruit and taking it to eat it in Jerusalem because you're praising God, because that's a commandment. You could eat the fruit wherever you are. That's the 5th year. And in the 5th year, you have the greatest blessing. It says, do this and you'll get additional blessing. Because in some ways, the goal of Judaism is not the prohibition in the first 3 years. It's not even the commandment in the 4th year to follow God's explicit commandments. That's important, but that's not the goal. The goal is the 5th year. That when you have the mundane fruit, they're no longer holy. It's not a commandment to eat it, but you're going to eat it for a spirit. You're going to eat it and sanctify it. The mundane, that is the ultimate goal of Judaism, and that's why this model of 3 categories: first 3 years, 4th year, 5th year is a pattern for everything we do in our life. And the greatest is the symbol of this week's parsha, which is not necessarily Yom Kippur, which would be the year 4, but it's every day, bringing holiness to the everyday. That would be year 5. Okay, we can't not, we have 3 minutes left. We can't not talk about the mitzvah to love your fellow as yourself. And the question becomes, the most simple question is that even possible? And it's not a very simple question to answer, because according to some commentaries, it's impossible. How could you love your fellow as yourself? We're naturally, we are wired to put ourselves first and take care of ourselves first and be concerned with ourselves first. So what is this thing that God says, love your fellow as yourself? Is it even possible? So like I said, there are commentators who say it's impossible to love your fellow as yourself. So what does the verse mean? The verse doesn't mean love your fellow as yourself. The verse means act as if you love your fellow as yourself. In other words, treat your fellow the way you want to be treated. Okay, that's possible. Because I can say, I love myself more than I love you, but I'm not going to be rude to you. I'll take care of you because I'm going to treat you the way I want to be treated. That's the famous statement that Hillel said, Sonny, what is hateful to you, don't do to others. Okay, that's one way of reading the verse, but it's not the straightforward reading of the verse, because the straightforward reading of the verse is love your fellow as yourself. Love your fellow just like you love yourself. So the people say, well, act as if, treat your fellow the way you treat yourself. But that's not the simple meaning of the verse. But
right. As he talks about it.
There's a Hasidic interpretation.
Rabbi, you are muted. Could you please unmute yourself?
I'm sorry. Yeah, I apologize. Okay. There's a Hasidic interpretation that says no. The Hasidic perspective is you could love your fellow as yourself, but to do so, you have to have a shift in perspective. What does that mean? Every person is both a body and a soul. I have a physical part of self, and I have a spiritual transcendent part of self. And the question is, what are the relationships between those two parts of myself? Which one is dominant? Like somebody put it, am I a body with a soul, or am I a soul with a body? In other words, do I identify primarily with the physical side of self? Or am I a person who's primarily identifies with the spiritual side of self? I have both. I'm not an angel. I have both. The question is, how do I self-define? Now, if I am a person who I see myself primarily as a body, impossible to love my fellow as myself. But if I see myself as primarily a soul, or another way of saying it, the more in touch I am with the soul, then the more when I see you, I don't see your body, I see your soul. And on the soul level, the soul feels one, my soul feels one with your soul, because all souls are part of one entity. All souls are part of one spiritual anatomy. So in other words, the question of whether or not I could love my fellow as yourself is a question of, could I identify with my soul? Could I identify with my soul, and therefore I'd be connected to my fellow? Or to say it in other words, in even simpler terms, because again, Hillel says this is the entire Torah. How is it the entire Torah? So to say it in simpler terms, if I'm a person, okay, I'm really saying another point. I'm saying that this is the entire Torah. How is it the entire Torah? In other words, loving my fellow as myself leads me to have a relationship with God as well. So if I'm a person who's self-oriented and I'm always focused inward, it's not going to lead me to God, because I'm focused on myself. I care about myself. I don't care about anything beyond myself. But if I learn to love my fellow, to see beyond myself, to transcend myself and see the other person's perspective and see the needs of the other person, I learn to see beyond myself. Then if I could learn to see beyond myself, that's also a path that brings me close to Hashem. So that's why Hillel says that loving your fellow as yourself, meaning going beyond your own perspective, going beyond your own self-interests, actually is the entire Torah, because it captures not only the parts of the Torah that regulate human behavior, but it also captures the spirit of the part of the Torah, which is fostering the relationship between you and God, because there could be no relationship between you and God if you're oriented and focused only on the self. If you learn transcendence, if you learn to connect to others, you learn to see beyond the needs of the self, then you can also relate to God himself. So that's a little bit about this parsha. Again, literally
Are we meeting tomorrow at 10?
I'm willing, yes.
Tomorrow at 10. Great.
Yes.
Great. Thank you for today.
Thank you, everybody, for joining. Comments, questions are welcome. Whatever we didn't cover this year, hopefully we'll cover in future years. So God will give us long life and peace of mind to be able to continue studying and growing, and most important, sanctifying not just the holy days of the year, but every day and every aspect of life.
Rabbi, this is so incredibly relevant to everybody's daily life and well-being, because the kinds of things that you're talking about really relate to interpersonal activities constantly throughout the day. And the kind of people that come to see me are people who clearly are very, very connected to themselves and their impulses. And it's what causes them to be angry and anxious so much of the time.
Fascinating. Thank you for that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
See you
And-
tomorrow.
Take care.